Anyway, okay, now I'm doing that. So it was around like the mid 1400s that Spain started actually coming together as a country. Castile and Aragon were united through marriage, and then I forget, that was called the Catholic. It was the two of them, the Catholic kings or something. It was the Isabel and Ferdinand. Their children all married into other like royal families around Europe. Two of their children married into the Habsburgs. I think one of them married into the Portuguese royal family. They had like six children, and they did a great job of marrying into all the other noble families of Europe, and so it like allied Spain with all these other countries. And then I think it was just a generation on from that, uh, the king of the heir to the Spanish throne also became the Holy Roman Empire emperor, and united the Habsburgs and the Spanish monarchy. And so it was like Habsburg Spain, and Habsburg Spain was the largest empire in the world. They had, they were connected to like the Low Countries, Eastern Europe, Bohemia, and at that point they were starting to have colonies in the New World. They'd conquered the Canary Islands and stuff. And that matters because a lot of those other places don't produce wine. But it was part of the same like kingdom, or they were allied. So Spain started exporting wine to all these other places. And also, if you're getting on a boat and you're sailing across the Atlantic Ocean and you're going to be stuck on a boat for a month or 2 months, you don't know, and then you're going to like the ends of the earth, you're going to want to take a lot of wine with you. So you're going to stop off like on the edge of Spain or the Canary Islands or somewhere like that, and you're going to load up as much fortified wine as you can into your boat before you leave, so that you have something to keep yourself going. So that helped continue develop the Spanish wine industry. And at the same time, like that was just when there was a lot more global trade happening between like Northern Europe, with with the Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, the Hanseatic League up there, England, the Scandinavian countries. Like people up there were getting more interested in wine, and it was relatively easy to put wine on a boat on the east coast of Spain and then like sail up through the English Channel. Things change again with phylloxera, the microscopic root louse that came to Europe through Bordeaux in the 1860s. It wiped out all the vines, slowly spread through France, wiped out all the vineyards. And first, it took a long time for them to figure out what to do. Like they didn't know, they were like trying to do all kinds of crazy chemical things to deal with phylloxera. But anyway, it wiped out all the vineyards, started in Bordeaux because Bordeaux is a port. That's where it came in through. A lot of French winemakers left and went to Spain because phylloxera didn't make it to Spain until significantly later because of the Pyrenees there. So like phylloxera didn't get to Rioja until 1901. So you had several decades where vineyards in Spain were not infected with phylloxera, were still producing wine, but the French weren't producing a whole lot of wine. And as I say on page 1 here, this seemed like the end times for the French. As a French person, what do you want at the end times? You want wine. But what exactly is the first thing that the end times are taking away from you? Wine. France panicked. Who was there to supply wine to France? Spain. So Spain produces, starts producing tons of wine, exporting it to France. And a lot of French winemakers leave France, go to Spain, particularly Rioja, because Rioja already like had a reputation. And so winemakers started going there, making wine, and they brought a lot of more modern techniques for winemaking, and also for like pruning and growing grapes, and brought them to Spain and helped sort of modernize the Spanish wine industry. Then phylloxera finally actually gets to Spain and starts wiping out vineyards. And by that point, they knew what to do. They knew that you could graft onto North American rootstock in order to like keep phylloxera from wiping out your vines. But it's still a ton of work to do all of that grafting and replanting. And then you can't really produce a lot of wine for a while. So a lot of like some small producers just stopped producing wine. They let their vineyards go. They moved on to something else because it just wasn't, they didn't have the money. They didn't have the time. You know, it wasn't something that you could just do on your own. Like you had to buy North American rootstock from somewhere. So it was expensive. It was a big hurdle for a lot of small producers. And a lot of winemakers also took this as an opportunity. You know, they were like any business owner, like when some terrible thing like a pandemic comes along, you pivot, you're like, well, is there something I should do here? Is this an opportunity? So a lot of winemakers said, okay, if I have to replant everything, I'm going to maybe replant with what I think are better grapes. I'm going to replant with grape varieties that are more productive, or, you know, like more resistant to disease, or that I think are going to be more popular, something like that. So, so a lot of regions, a lot of vineyards changed the grape varieties that they were growing when they replanted from phylloxera. Bringing us up mostly to the present day. So at that point, though, Spain is still like a feudal society. Spanish Civil War, which a lot of people think of as a prelude to World War II, which it kind of sort of was in terms of trying out military technology, but it's actually a lot more than that. The Spanish Civil War was basically primarily a class war. It was a struggle between like landless peasants and disaffected industrial workers, trying to assert their rights against the aristocracy, the Catholic Church, the government, and you had several years of like left-leaning liberal politicians getting elected and trying to institute reforms, but not moving fast enough for a lot of the far left, or like the peasants who were like, when am I gonna not be starving anymore? And then at the same time, you had the landed aristocracy seeing like left-wing people getting elected and talking about land reforms and being like, oh my God, they're going to take my land. So a lot of it was class war, but there was also a lot of religion mixed in, because the Catholic Church was very close to the government and the aristocracy. And so the left was attacking the Catholic Church. And the right was using the Catholic Church as a way to try and like hold on to support from people. Also, a lot of ideology. There was there was a very large anarchist movement in Spain, like real like people that believed like the government has always been oppressive. We should just not have government anymore. Like we should just be like individual free determination. And then also, to make it even more complicated, you had particular regions like Barcelona and Catalonia that had very distinct cultures and languages that saw the strife, the discord as an opportunity to advance their own independence and say like, well, we want to like self-determination, we want to go our own way. So Catalonia was doing that. The Basque countryside was pushing for that. And then at the same time, you also had the Soviet Union and you had Nazi Germany, both trying to advance their particular interests. The Nazis were supporting the fascist movement in Spain, and the Soviets were supporting the Leninists and the communists in Spain. And then it blew up. And as I put in here, I mean, it basically just blew up. I'll send out an email about next week's seminar, and I'll include a link to a fantastic video I watched last night from, I think it's from the 70s, when a lot of people from the Spanish Civil War were actually still alive. And it's a lot of first-person footage from the buildup to the war, explaining what was going on and actually interviewing like just tons of random people that had been there. So the Spanish Civil War obviously just devastated the country, and they didn't produce much wine. Afterwards, though, so then it was a fascist military regime for decades, and lots of bad things about that. Not going to try to go there, but the government was really concerned with national identity, and the government did spend a lot of effort on trying to like modernize winemaking, rebuild the wine industry, trying to get people to replant and grow grape varieties that were more productive or that were more popular or common or whatever, to like try to build a national identity instead of having all these different little regions growing completely different grapes. Chris, did you want to jump in there?
Hello. How are you? um, yeah, I mean, I think the word is that the government actually subsidized growers to rip out their native vines and plant, particularly Garnacha Tintorera, which has turned out to actually be a pretty good grape for Spain, and Palomino.
Mhm.
And that definitely affected, you know, certain regions more pronouncedly. And then also like co-ops at the time would pay and must wait. So there was very little like there was very little, kind of, the farmers had very little like, what's the word, uh, God, my brain. Anyways,
incentive for quality.
Incentive, yeah, to incentive for quality, to harvest the grapes exactly at the right time. And so a lot of the regions just kind of went from having a huge grape diversity, particularly on the eastern side of Spain, the sunnier side, Catalonia, the Levant. They had much more of and Galicia, more kind of in the marginal kind of areas. Galicia still has its grape diversity, but Palomino and Garnacha Tintorera, Alicante Bouschet really like invaded. But yeah, so.
Yeah. And then I mean, so that pretty much brings us up to like present day Spain now. I guess the one to go to present day Spain, the Franco regime, sort of like, I don't know, retarded growth in Spain, like held Spain back for a long time. And then when the regime finally ended, when Spain became a democracy, and then the EU was created, and eventually the common currency in Spain, like was a part of the EU. It made it very easy for Spain to export wine to the rest of Europe, to Britain and the Netherlands and Germany. And because it's hot and sunny and dry and easy to make wine there, it gave Spain a huge advantage for producing like inexpensive, drinkable wines. So Spain really focused on trying to take over that like inexpensive, good, like supermarket wine kind of market. And that's what they did up through, I don't know, like 10 years ago or something like that. And then I feel like now things are changing, and like Spanish winemakers are looking more and more beyond that. But that's sort of like, that's where Spain was, and now things are moving on and like breaking up and diversifying from there.
Can I
Chris.
add to that a little bit?
Yeah.
One of the things I talk about, Ned has done an amazing job. I don't know Spanish history as well as Ned has said it. I generally focus on the 20th century when I talk about Spanish wine, but I would add that in the 70s, like let's just say pre 1980, Spanish wine during the let's say Franco era, Rioja, sherry, these were they were strong industries, and they essentially, allowed. That's why there are a lot of big producers in Rioja and sherry, particularly, right? And they were allowed to exist and somewhat prosper. There was one lone estate in the Ribera del Duero called Vega Sicilia, and they at that point had made Spain's most famous wine. That was the wine of kings. I mean, this is Castile Leon. This is the kingdom of Spain. The Castilians are the folks that drove the Moors out of Spain. The Spanish we speak is Castellano. But around in 1982, there was a wine that an emerging wine critic named Robert Parker reviewed, and he gave it a crazy score, like 98, 99 points. And it was a Pesquera 1982, which was the first kind of modern Ribera del Duero to sort of emerge. And I mean, Ribera del Duero is actually a fairly new denomination. You know, a lot of this Spanish denominations kind of started in the early 20th century, went to the mid 20th century, and then a lot of them sort of emerged in the 70s, 80s, and on. So Pesquera becomes like the big hot wine, and it's earlier drinking than Vega Sicilia. And around the same time, there was a revolution in Priorat, led by a bunch of French guys and women, actually, and some native Spaniards, and those ended up being a lot of the famous names: Alvaro Palacios, you have Clos Mogador, Mas Martinet, all these kind of modern style Priorats. And at the same time, these were beloved wines by Robert Parker. And really what happened was modern Spanish wine, and especially the warmer regions, essentially tried to copy the styles of wines that were being made by these wines that were getting a lot of points. So partially, yes, Spain made wines at the lower end, but also there was a lot of aspirational winemaking to use new oak, enzymes, acid, all kinds of stuff to make this idyllic wine. And that's why these wine regions are so big. They're really political wine regions. They're there to like let people, you know, grow many hectares of grapes and make these uber modern wines. I just want to add that because I think that's really important to understand. Like when Ned and I first came into the business, Spanish wine was cheap and cheerful or really modern. Oh, we used to think it was the Australian wine of Spain. I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that, Ned, but like 10, 15 years
pretty
ago,
much, yeah.
it was a sort of sad, you know.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'll stop.
Yeah. Actually, so let me introduce Chris Barnes. Chris, how long have you been with Jose Pastor?
8.5 years.
Okay. Yeah. So, all right. So Chris does national sales for Jose Pastor Selections, and Jose Pastor is, like, as far as I know, Jose Pastor Selections is sort of like the first mover to really focus on, like, I don't know, like indigenous, natural, like exciting Spanish wines. Like some of the very first natural wines that were like real, actual, like quote unquote natural wines that I drank were Jose Pastor wines, like 12, 13 years ago in New York, you know, like wandering around and stumbling on crazy things. So, you know, Jose Pastor, the company, and Jose Pastor, the person, has a great perspective on like how Spanish wine culture and industry has been changing and evolving.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, dude. Jose is from Spain and grew up with the great estates of Spain, working in the hospitality industry, like when he was a kid, you know, like a kid and a teenager, you know, and but I would say like there's kind of a hierarchy, right? In the 80s, it was Classical Wines of Spain, Jorge Ordonez. They represented all of the fine Spanish wine. Then came Eric Solomon and European Cellars, and then De Masson Selections and Ole Imports. And I would say those guys sort of paved the way for Jose. We started in 2001 when Jose had just turned 21. And we started off as like a mix of private labels, which was very common at the time, and some estate wines that Jose's family had relationships with in Spain. And I think Jose's the first to recognize the grower, the vigneron, you know, the French idea of the person that works the soil and makes the wine. That became Jose's obsession around, like Ned said, maybe that's when I discovered Jose's wines, was about 13, 14 years ago. And we've evolved. We used to dream about, like, what if they made garnacha this way, or mencia like this, or, all that stuff, and without sulfur, and, those kinds of things. And now it's like a total reality. Now, you used to like have to like really look hard to find anything you wanted to drink. And then when you found something, you're like, oh my gosh, and now it's like, take your pick. There's several importers that specialize in natural wines from Spain, good friends of ours too, like Alvaro de la Vina, who tastes
Next
some of his
week.
wines today. He's a great colleague, comrade. Like Jose and him are really good friends. So, I think, when I first met Alvaro, he was like, you paved the way for me, like so it's kind of like it goes in, comes in waves, and kind of it's a progression. So how it's all evolved.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to talk about this. So this is the first wine, the Ere Herrero, and then this Verdejo. And then after that, we're going to do the Dandelion, the Pallido, and then the Lasenda. So we'll run through those three wines in order. So I'll talk about this Verdejo quickly, and then we'll jump into the three Jose Pastor wines that we've got here. So this is a Verdejo. Verdejo. This is from Rueda. Rueda is like northwest of Madrid. I think like 150 kilometers. It's a large DO that's on the Duero River. That's downriver from Ribera del Duero, close to the DO of Toro. Rueda primarily produces Verdejo, or like that's what it's known for. They do grow red grapes here, but you don't see as much red wine from here. I don't know. Am I right, Chris, in saying like Rueda, Verdejo? Rueda is a pretty commercial DO that's like focused on this. They have this very clear identity of what they produce. These Verdejos like this that are pretty clean. And topical.
They do. I mean, like appellations in Spain, there tends to be kind of this monolithic mentality within the appellation system. Mm-hmm. And, Rueda has a long history of growing grapes. I mean, they have vines in the region that are pre-phylloxera because they have sandy soils, that are Verdejo. But before modernization in the 70s, they produced wines that were more oxidative in character, Pallidos and Dorados, like the Gomez Novato, actually, same terminologies, pale and golden. It was in the 70s when Marquez de Riscal, I believe, or it's one of the Marquez, one of those fancy families, wanted to make a white style Bordeaux because they were sort of unsatisfied with what Rioja was producing at the time. And they went looking in Rueda because they saw the potential in the Verdejo grape. So, but the wine style there that's predominant in the DO is a choice. Like Verdejo can really be a lot of different things. It can be quite full-bodied and glycerol, and one of the great things is it has a fantastic pH acidity, even at a higher alcohol. So you can make crispy wines like that has become really, emblematic of the area.
Yeah. This actually, so what we're drinking right now, this is sort of on the more like viscous, like riper end. To me, this is still like classic Verdejo. Like it has very classic Verdejo flavors. It's like a little bit aromatic, like white flowers, tropical fruit, sort of like peachy pineapple-y, but like not too much, not too in your face.
Yeah, if it has real structure, like real mouthfeel to it, to me, that's close to representation of the grape. A lot of the producers are trying to make New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc style wines, so they use the same yeast that they use in New Zealand, the same fermentation techniques, cold fermentation, with yeasts usually. At it,
Yeah.
the Rueda that we know is not really, if it has
Right.
more body, that's generally, to me, that's more typical of the grape. It's of what is the grape really is.
Yeah. This is somewhere. So they have a very modern winery. Like this is done in stainless steel. It's very clean. It's not oxidative at all and stuff. Um, it is organically farmed, and they're not using like yeasts from New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc or like isolated yeasts. They're using cultured yeasts, but they're yeasts from their own vineyard that they that they identified and that they've propagated and they keep and they use and stuff. So it's not just spontaneous fermentation, but it is, they're not using like engineered yeasts and enzymes from other places to try and like achieve different flavors and stuff like that. So yeah.
Who imports that, Ned?
That's Village Wines, formerly C&P.
Oh yeah.
Chris Campbell. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I know him.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on from there and jump into the Dandelion Albarino, because Galicia and Rias Baixas are one of my favorite Spanish wine regions, and I think Galicia is really important because Galicia like held on to a lot more of its. It feels like Galicia held on to a lot more of its wine culture, its indigenous culture, than a lot of the rest of Spain did.
Yeah, that has a lot to do with their isolation. Galicia, it's a very Spanish chauvinistic thing to describe like Galicians as the rednecks of Spain. They don't speak Spanish. They speak a hybrid of Spanish and Portuguese called Galego or Gallego.
I get the impression that the Galicians would take that as a compliment, that they're described as like the rednecks of Spain.
They would. I mean, they're like the Basque and the Catalans. They're very proud of their culture. I mean, they're Galician nationalists who want to separate from Spain there too, Galicia, a huge portion of the people emigrated. So like the name for Galicians in South America in some parts were Gallego, or Spanish were Gallegos. There were so many Gallegos that emigrated. I mean, Cuba is famously, like, a lot of high percentage of Cubans come from Galicia. Fidel Castro. I mean, anytime you see the name Castro, like that's that's like Smith in Galicia. So, do you want me to talk about the wine?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, tell me about the
okay.
Nanclares.
So this is a Nanclares y Prieto. So this is Alberto Nanclares. He's a Basque guy. He was an economist in a former life and wanted to retire by the ocean. He was passionate about sailing boats, and so he found really romantic story. He found a home right on the Ria Arausa in Rias Baixas. The Ria Arausa is very, very famous for its mussels, razor clams. It is the most famous Ria for shellfish and seafood in general. So these vineyards are very close to the ocean. Rias Baixas is referring to the five fingers that jut out into the ocean, the Rias. And also around the Ria Arausa is where the Val de Salnes is. And that's considered to be the heart of Albarino production and possibly the ancestral home of the grape, more than likely. I mean, there are theories that Albarino the parent grape is Riesling from, say, 1,000 years ago, a product of the Camino de Santiago, which runs across Spain and ends in Rias Baixas and Santiago de Compostela. Partially, the Camino de Santiago is what makes Galician grape growing so rich, we think. Alberto Nanclares settled in Rias Baixas. His home came with a vineyard. He's like, oh, it's a nice thing for an old guy to do, tend some vines. So he started selling his grapes to larger wineries, and he was using chemicals at first because that's what everybody in the area told him. You need to use herbicides, you need to use pesticides. It's too humid here. You have to do that. It's just the way it is. He hated
I
it.
add super quickly.
Yeah,
Galicia is not like the rest of Spain. Galicia is actually very wet and rainy. It's all like decayed granite soil. There's like no flat land. It's that point up there above Chris's head that sticks out into the North Atlantic. So it's like it's in the North Atlantic there. It's like yeah.
yeah.
It's very, very oceanic. It's cooler. They get a lot of rain. It's very different from the rest of Spain.
It's totally different. Green Spain in general is totally different, but Galicia particularly has this like misty, almost, I mean, it does not feel, it feels otherworldly to me.
Yeah.
I also, I'm hugely passionate about Galicia and its wines. And it's, anyways. So, Albarino is the main grape here. This is the Val de Salnes, the heart of Rias Baixas production. So the way the vineyards are in Rias Baixas is that they're very much broken up, small parcels, kind of usually attached to homes. Sometimes churches or former churches will have a vineyard. It's not like a homogenous, not a homogenous wine region. In a couple places you can drive around and see vineyards, a lot of vineyards around, but it's really kind of fragmented. And so that has been fortunate for like co-ops, because people would just grow the grapes, make some wine, keep it for themselves, and then sell the grapes to the bigger co-ops. And the co-ops would just collect grapes from different producers. Alberto started, he stopped doing that, and he's like, I'm going to be a vineyard. So he hired a woman to make his wine for him, and he eventually parted ways with her because she wanted to deacidify the wines, the wines. So Albarino is one of the highest acid grapes on the planet, like Riesling, and it's routine in the region for producers to add potassium to the juice to bring the acidity level down and to make a more round, pleasant wine. And that's partially why Albarino can be very varied. It can be rich and lush and oily, tropical. It can be citrusy and lean, and it can be kiwi and herbal. And, there's a lot of different variation the way Albarino is made, because like Rueda and a lot of other Spanish wines, it's a highly aspirational wine. People make wines what they think the international market will like. And that has dictated a lot of the styles. But when you go to a good wine bar, you see Non-Clares, you see Albamar, you see Paso de Señorens, you see, people in Galicia know what good wine is. Like I thought it was an underdeveloped culture, but now it feels like a very well-developed wine culture. They're very proud of their wines now. And, you see a lot of progression. One of the things that makes Non-Clares really unique is, besides the fact that they farm organically, very unusual, but they ferment with indigenous yeasts. They do block the malolactic, which is oftentimes not natural for Albarino to go through malolactic, because it has such a high acidity level. The wines don't oftentimes naturally go through mallow, and they don't filter or fine the wines. So Dandelion is kind of a collection of their own estate fruit mixed with some purchased fruit that they work with growers that don't use herbicides or chemicals in their vineyards. And, that's all verified. These are people that have very strong relationships where it's like a lease kind of thing. It's not just like buying random grapes to throw in a vat,
Yeah.
So yeah, it's all stainless steel. On the lees, he does not stir the lees. Alberto is you go there, you feel like you're in a German winery. Every tank has pH, tartric, sulfur levels. You can see he is very precise about the way he makes wine, the way he bottles. I mean, and you can feel it in the wines. There's a lot of precision. Sometimes the natural process has kind of blown back on him. They have had residual sugar in the past in the wines. Yeah, so he also, Non-Clares is now Non-Clares and Prieto. He brought on a woman that he knew from the local laboratory that would do laboratory analysis on Rias Baixas wines, Silvia Prieto. And so when Alberto really actually retires, he's in his 60s, Sylvia will take over his work. And they've become this dynamic duo. They make red wines now in Rias Baixas, which we added this year. And they also make some red wines in Ribera Sacra and Ribeiro and different things. So it's really quite a dynamic project.
It's a very dynamic wine. Like the acidity is really, like the acidity drives it. Like the acidity there in the mid palate is fantastic and like gives the wine this real like focus, this edge. And then it's got all of this like stone fruit to it, though, that the acidity like picks it up, but it's a very like, I don't know, I wouldn't call it like lush, but it's like a very like sort of outgoing, extroverted white wine. And then it's got this awesome salty brine in like the mid paladin finish that to me is like really, really classic Albarino. I like wines like this that have like big, but almost like conflicting, like juxtaposed flavors, like this ripe, like stone fruit, but then also like that really like cutting acidity, and then also like salt and minerality and stuff is really cool. And I think that's
what makes
like,
Albarino special,
right?
man.
That's Albarino. That's what makes Albarino so exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Next up is the Sierra Moranna Polygo. Right. Somewhere I have a bottle of it that's not empty. Here we go. Right there.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite wines in our book. I visited these guys several years back. So the Sierra Morena is the mountain range that divides Andalusia. So Andalusia's famous wine regions are Sherry, Jerez, Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which makes Manzanilla, and then you have El Puerto de Santa Maria, which also makes Sherry or Jerez, and then you have Montilla Moriles, which is further inland, and they're more famous for their sweet wines, but they also make fabulous dry wines. In fact, the word Amontillado is referring to the style of wines from Montilla. So Montilla has a deep history of wine growing. That would be the closest known wine region to the Sierra Morena. So when you go here, you would probably stay in Cordoba, which is a fantastic city. If you ever get to go to Spain, I highly recommend going to the south. It's the most, when we think of Spanishness, we're really talking about Andalusianness. So you can go there and see Moorish architecture. And like Ned was saying, the Moors were in Granada up until 1492. So there's a lot of Moorish influence in those major cities of Cordoba, Granada, Jerez, Malaga, all those places. So you go to Cordoba, and then you just head north from there, and you wind up mountain roads, scary mountain roads, and you get into this place called Villa Viciosa, the vicious village de Cordoba. And that's where Gomez Novato is. They've been making wine since, I believe on the label, it says 1888. Is that right? 1892, 1870 something?
1870.
1870.
Yeah.
And they have made wines in the traditional sherry style. And they use the old school Montilla vernacular of just Pallido, Dorado, and Avocado. Pale, golden, sweet. And they work with a slightly different grape blend here. It's a 60% Aris, which is also called Iren, which is a little known fact. It's the most planted grape in Spain and the world. And 20% Pedro Jimenez or PX, that's the traditional grape of Montilla Moriles, and then 20% Palomino, the traditional grape of Jerez. And they're the first certified organic producer in Spain. On the back label, it says Agricultura Eco 01. The proof is on the back label. Since the early 80s. And they make the old Solera style. They have old vines, which is unusual. Most of sherry is made with young vines that get ripped up. As soon as they start yielding lower, the young vines get ripped up and put even younger vines in. And that's become the standard in the land of sherry, is this kind of more industrial style of agriculture. It's changing, and people are working to save old vineyards. So sherry is a very exciting place right now. But what makes, for me, Gomez Novato, this wine sees around 4 to 5 years of aging, all under floor. It's not a floor like they have in Jerez and closer to the coast. So floor is the veil of yeast that develops on top of the wine, because they don't top off the barrels, and it really informs the taste of sherry. And it's an acquired taste. A lot of Americans don't like it. It's too savory. It gives a salty sensation. But the Pallido here, it's a thin veil of floor, and they also use indigenous yeasts, Pied de Couve, to make the wine. So they start fermentation themselves, and without added yeast. And it's just fascinating, the oiliness, the viscosity of this wine. I describe it as being more vinous and less floor influence, less sherry like in a way. It's not fortified, so all the alcohol is natural. It comes from evaporation. So in some wine regions, alcohol will actually evaporate from a wine, or water. Like, it depends on where you are, elevation, average barometric pressure, I assume. Ned might actually know. But here, all the alcohol is around 15% alcohol, and it's natural. It's from evaporation. They actually harvest at around 11.
Okay. Wow.
So, yeah, all those things. Sherry is aged in old botas, so they use the really old American oak barrels to age the wines. The wine is en rama, meaning that it doesn't get the sterile filtration or the cold filtration that many sherries get. And so sometimes, especially in the Pallido, it can be more golden than pale. And sometimes it can be a little cloudy, to be honest. It doesn't affect the flavor, in my opinion. I think it's wonderful.
Pretty golden, but yeah, I love this wine. Yeah. It smells like it. I mean, I smell nuts. I smell almonds. It's a little bit. It's got that sharp, like, oxidative, like some oxidative, but it's not. The wine itself isn't that oxidized.
Does that have that like green olive kind of note?
Yeah,
The
green olive is a good way to put it. Yeah. Yep.
Gomez Novato, or they have two businesses that function. They're just like right down the road from each other. They're organic olive oil producers as well.
Okay.
And they're very, very well regarded olive oil producers.
Okay.
And I always find this green olive note in this wine. It just makes you want.
Very much on the palate. Yeah, there's this oily, like spicy, sort of bitter, sort of smoky, like piece in the mid palate of the wine.
Yeah, these wines they're not easy to describe. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why Americans don't love sherry in a way, is because they can be fairly cerebral. They really shine with food.
It tastes like cured meat to me in the finish. There's this like salty, savory, like meaty, almost like sensation to the wine that lingers on after the finish.
I also, when I visited these guys, we were driving on the road and I saw a whole herd of the jamon, of the Iberico pigs.
Yeah.
Hanging out just outside of the village. And I had to stop. I've never been to like Extremadura, where they're more like, that's where most of jamon biota comes from. But the famous Spanish pigs they raise them around this area. It's really freaking cool, man. Like, and I always think like what grows together goes together. And somehow this wine just totally corresponds to the things they produce with food around this area. I mean, you want ham with this, you want olives, you want the traditional tapas foods. When we ate there, they made this chicken dish in a very rich, savory sauce with thyme and onions, and I don't know, that was magical too. So
I'm pouring the Lasenda now. I would recommend everybody, if you have something to rinse with, either like rinse with a little bit of wine or rinse with a little bit of water or something like that, because the sherry or the Pallido is a pretty strong, unique flavor. So
yeah, give it a good rinse.
yeah. All right, so on to Bierzo. Bierzo is up in the northwest, up adjacent to Galicia, but it's on the other side of the mountains. So it's different. It's more continental and different soil type, right?
Yeah, mostly clay, mostly sandy clay.
Okay.
There's some slate up in the mountains. The producers talk about slate more than they actually exist.
Okay.
You actually have to farm wines that are in the mountain, grapes that are in the mountains on slate. Yeah, so that's Vindematrix. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Diego Losada, he's the vigneron. He's an interesting guy. He's very into heavy metal and movies. He speaks perfect English, and he said he learned English from watching Scorsese movies, which I love. And I guess he's sort of a disaffected Berzano. He wanted to he kind of got into agriculture and like making wine, and worked for some other wineries, notably Gregory Perez, who I think was represented by T. Edward, and used to work with us back in the day. They worked together at Luna Beberide, and then he worked with Gregory as assistant winemaker, and then kind of struck out on his own in the early 2000s and started leasing and purchasing vineyards. Herbicides are really common in Bierzo, unfortunately. So he really made a point to find vineyards that are up in the mountains, away, usually sheltered by forest and without other vineyards around. So he didn't have to deal with a neighbor using herbicide. He's a big heavy metal fan, which you can tell by his labels. His labels are drawn by his tattoo artist. He has Pure Wine tattooed on his knuckles.
I love the snakes on it.
He's hilarious.
Yeah.
Oh man, I should have found this. He sent me a story around that label on Instagram. It would take a while to find that, but he definitely minimal intervention from the beginning. But in 2015, I believe, is when he eliminated sulfites altogether. So he does not use any sulfur. He doesn't filter the wines. He makes wine in a tiny little garage. He stacks, the way he stacks barrels and stuff. I mean, it's really pretty rustic and kind of intense.
So this is 0-0. This is zero sulfur. This is nothing at all added to it.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Zero sulfur, zero filtration, all the wines. He says that, that's not for everybody, but it's for me. He idolizes Dario Princic, this hardcore natural winemaker. He doesn't really love Spanish wine. He drinks a lot of wine from Northern Italy, and that kind of informs his wine style, how he perceives his project and stuff. He's a really interesting guy. But this cuvee, it's a mix of Mencia, some Doña Blanca, and Palomino.
Okay.
So it's a red and white blend. So it's a co-fermentation. It's very typical in the past in Spain, and especially in Castile and Leon, but all over the place, to plant white and red grapes and co-ferment them.
Okay.
Mencia itself is not a high acid grape. People think it is because it has bright flavors.
Yeah.
And not a lot of tannin. But Mencia actually is a low acid grape, and it likes to be acidified or co-fermented with other higher acid grape varieties. So it's very typical in Galicia and northern Western Spain in general to blend Mencia with other grapes, whether it be red or white grapes.
Okay.
So that's this vineyard. It's very old. He works with almost, centenarian age vineyards that were planted right after phylloxera, which is also typical in northwestern Spain to find a lot of really old vineyards that date from that specific era of just after phylloxera or just after Civil War, as we were talking about earlier. Triple whammy of Spain was phylloxera, Civil War, and then the bad guys won, the fascists.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I gotta say this. So I love Menthia. Menthia is like the dominant, or the. It's funny to say the dominant red grape of up here in the Northwest, because they don't produce a whole lot of red wines in Galicia. But like what red wines they do produce are generally Menthia. And then over here in Bierzo. But I've always liked Menthia from Galicia, from like the minerally granitic soils over there. Like I feel like it gives it a real like crunchy focus, like drive that reminds me of like good Cru Beaujolais and stuff. But then in the past, I had until the Lasenda wines, I'd actually never found a Bierzo that I liked or that lived up to the hype. I feel like I started reading about and seeing Bierzo like 10 years ago or something like that. Like that was, I feel like 10 years ago or so was like when Bierzo started hitting the rest of the world, and like wine magazines started writing about Bierzo and stuff like that in Menthia. But all of them that I tried were all like, felt like they were unbalanced, like they were overripe or something. Like the fruit was heavy and dense, and there was a real sort of like gamey, funky, earthy sort of quality to them. But then they were lacking other structure. Like they didn't have acidity, they didn't have minerality, and they didn't have tannin. They were just like heavy and fruity and sort of like earthy and gamey, but like lacking everything else. And but the Lasenda wines, even though they're from Bierzo, the Lasenda wines, not just this, but the 1984, like all of them, are really, really well structured. Like they have acidity and they have minerality and stuff, and they're not overripe. I've been really impressed with these wines. I really enjoy them. I love Menthia. Like I love how expressive Menthia is. I love the sort of like the juicy, bright fruit flavors that it has. I really like it when it has this background supporting structure to it.
Yeah, Menthia is one of those grapes. So they planted Menthia after phylloxera because they knew that it would ripen, and they knew that it would give flavor to a wine. So it wasn't like people were like, I'm going to make fine wines from it. That really became more prevalent with a Bierzo producer named Raul Perez, who is like a very brilliant winemaking mind. And he is fairly minimal interventionist in his approach. But he sort of changed his family, Castro Ventosa. They're the largest landholders in Bierzo. And they sort of changed wine, the perception of wine. But like Ned was saying, partially the problem in Bierzo is just that probably they're growing the wrong grape, to be honest. Like they should probably grow more of a grape diversity. There's a strong quality driven thing there. People are trying to make Tempranillo style Menthias too. That was also a problem, is that because Bierzo is part of Castile Leon, and like the closest wine region would be like Toro or Ribera del Duero in the Castile Leon. I mean, the closest wine regions are actually Galician, but they're still influenced by being in Castile Leon. So they wanted to make the big hard hitting wines that they were making in Toro and Ribera del Duero. And that just, Menthia is not supposed to be like that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, this is classic Menthia though, even though this has Doña Blanco in it. And what was the other white grape? Was it Palomino?
Palomino and Doña Blanca. So it's just some white grapes blended in. It has so much character that you could blend 30-40% of another grape, and Menthia will show. I mean, we work with a producer that does 70% Garnacha Tintorera and 30% Menthia, and you could still taste the Menthia. I mean, it's still like right there. It's it's like Syrah. I can, it's like Syrah with a Pinot Noir type of elegance if you treat it the right way. So like big vertical aromatics of violets and fruits, more red than dark usually, but in Bierzo they can make very Syrah like, even Northern Rhone like wines. I think like Alain Griot is making wine in Bierzo now, like for fun, I guess.
Believe it.
Um,
Yeah.
so, Menthea has more in common with Syrah than it used to be compared to a lot to Cabernet Franc, but they're talking about the green flavors that exist in the Galicia side from high yields. But when you farm Menthea well and take care of it, it's a lot more like Syrah, but in an elegant, graceful, bright kind of.
This actually, now that you're saying it, this has a little bit of like a black olive thing to it in like the mid palate, the finish, which is to me reminds me of like Northern Rhone Syrah, like some of the cooler climate, like focused, edgy Syrahs from the Northern Rhone that have like that have the aromatics that Syrah can have in cooler climates, and then also have this like black olivey like spice to them. Yeah. Cool. All right. Thank you. Is there anything else that you want to say, Chris, before I jump into other wines?
I don't know. Thanks for having me, Ned. Thank you, everyone. I don't know who any of you are yet. Maine was like on the top of my list for a potential visit. Then COVID happened. So we started Ned a year ago, like right at this time.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know. I'm a Northeasterner, but I live in New Mexico, and I've never been to Maine. So
yeah.
Well, I
know.
Really,
geez, come on. I know, Paige.
I really look forward to coming, and I know you all have like a really dynamic food and wine scene, and I think a lot of that has to do with the work of the man that's hosting today.
I think a lot of it has to do with like just where we are, that we're in an awesome place with great seafood and like farms here and stuff like that. But thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Second half of this year, I'm really optimistic that the second half of this year we'll be able to do cool stuff. I want to start planning things now and whatnot. So, we should talk about planning something for like the autumn. So
nice. Yeah. Right. Well, I hope to meet y'all in person, and thanks for having me. Jose Pastor Selections, I think like when you turn around our back label, you're going to get something of authenticity, of freshness, of, made a wine made by a real person.
Absolutely.
If you ever have any questions, you can always reach out to me, chris@josepastorselections.com. I'm a armchair salesperson at this point. Like I get back to people usually right away. So, you can always get my information from Ned if you work with any of the wines and there's something you're not seeing or want to know, or anecdotally, whatever. I'm always available. So cheers. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm really glad that I'm working with you guys. All right. Thanks, Chris.
Well, peace.
See you later.
Enjoy the rest of the tasting. Cheers.
All right. So now I'm going on to this label that tells you nothing at all about what it is. What is that? It's a K and pie. What is this? It's Daniel Ramos. Backwards, Daniel Ramos. So this is the Sierra de Grados. So a lot of the wines that we've done so far, like the Pallido, the Rueda, the Albarino, like those are very good wines, but they're like classic styles. They're like appellations or styles that have existed for a relatively long time. They're established in Spain, because I'm trying to focus on like where Spain has come from, where is Spain now, not future, which is next week is Spain again, but it's like where Spain is going, looking forwards. This is a good, like transition. This is the Sierra de Grados, which are these mountains outside of Madrid. So it's pretty high elevation. I want to say off the top of my head, this is like 700 something meters above sea level. So, somewhere like 2,500 feet above sea level here up in the mountains, very dry. And there's a lot of old vines out here. It's like very rocky, rough, rural countryside. This is Garnacha. There's a lot of Garnacha up here in the Sierra de Grados. I forget. Let me get to share screen, share, and here we go. Daniel Ramos. Here are some pictures of what the Sierra de Grados looks like. I don't know. I don't think I can actually like blow these pictures up, but that's Daniel Ramos. Pretty much all the vines here are bush vines. They are untrained. They're not trellised. Old vine, garnacha, but it's such like high elevation, exposed, like windy and cool enough because it's high elevation. Let me go back to this. That how do I end screen share now? Stop share. There we go. That like this isn't as exuberant and juicy as, you know, when you think of like old vine garnacha from Spain that's like really ripe, you know, like normally it's super concentrated and like unctuous. So Sierra de Grados, they have a lot of super old vines there, so obviously they've been growing grapes for a long time and making wine, but it's one of those regions that just sort of like fell out of fashion, that like people moved on from the Sierra de Grados, and winemaking like sort of faded and fell by the wayside there. And then in the past, like, I don't know, 20 years, 15, 20 years, it's sort of been rediscovered. And so Daniel Ramos is sort of Australian, half, I think maybe his mother is Australian, but he was raised in Madrid. So he was raised in Spain, but sort of exposed to like wine and the rest of the world, studied winemaking and was working as a like contract professional winemaker around Spain, and sort of discovered the Sierra de Grados. Someone hired him to work at a new winery they were starting in the Sierra de Grados, and he went and, you know, saw what was there and was just amazed that there were all of these really old vines that, you know, no one outside of the area were really cared about or appreciated yet. And so he relocated there with his wife, and they started buying land and started a winery and stuff like that. So this is organically farmed, hand harvested, fermented with native yeast. And then this is aged in amphora, in clay amphora, tinaja, which amphora are actually more common in Spain than anywhere else in like Western Europe. Like they still actually manufacture them here. There are still places that are like know how to cast, because it's a particular skill and technique to be able to cast like a big giant, you know, amphora and urn basically out of terracotta and get it to all fire correctly and evenly, and, you know, not like break or, you know, anyway. So there are actually still people doing that in Spain. You can still get new amphoras. So this is fermented and aged in amphora, and it's to me it's really elegant. It's where does it say? It's, according to the label, it's 15% alcohol. It might be, but it doesn't obviously taste like it. It doesn't seem like that. It's not as big and in your face. It smells more sort of savory. It smells a little bit like woodsy and a little bit smoky, a little brambly. So it's kind of, it's a good example of where Spain is, that this is this old forgotten region, but this new winemaker, this guy who, like, you know, grew up in the city in Madrid and like is part Australian, and he's coming here and making wine like for export for the rest of the world. But he's making this, the Cape Amphora, using really traditional techniques that like he's trying to make he's trying to make a wine that is like how people were making wine here like 100 years ago. You know, like they were making wine in amphora because amphora were cheaper than stainless steel or cement tanks or something like that. Like amphora were just what people had. That was traditional. And when you making wine in amphora, usually they get exposed to oxygen a tiny bit, and so it's like it's not an oxidative wine, but it's exposed to oxygen just enough that it helps like stabilize the wine. And you don't, you know, if a wine has already been exposed to oxygen and it's already a tiny bit oxidized, you don't have to worry about it like spoiling or getting oxidized in the shipping and storage process as much. So it was a way of preserving wine in the past. So anyway, you know, he's like this new winemaker who came from somewhere else, but he's making extremely traditional wine in this very traditional but forgotten wine region. So it's like it's traditional, but it's also sort of a rebirth in a way. And that's what's happening in a lot of Spain and Spanish wine culture right now. There's a fair amount of tannin. I don't think it's too much. I like that, but it's like this again. That's like old school, like Spain, like a fair amount of tannin. It's a more like powerful, dry, structured, savory wine. But also, again, like if I was just blind tasting this, I don't think I would guess that this was Grenache. Like this is not, to me, like this is not classically what I think of, what I imagine Grenache generally being like. And then moving on to the final wine, Libando Rioja. So this is a Rioja Crianza. The vintage here is 2015. So we've already sort of talked about Rioja a little bit. Rioja historically, Rioja is like the most established, most prestigious Spanish wine region. If you leave aside like sherry, but Rioja is the most like internationally established, prestigious region. It has a connection to Bordeaux because a lot of winemakers moved there after phylloxera, and they brought with them this tradition of aging wine in small oak barrels. Like most aging of wine in Spain had been in like big, huge oak casks that are kept for a long time and they don't really give a flavor to the wine. But in Bordeaux, they were using significantly smaller oak barrels that would give some flavor to the wine, and also a smaller vessel, a smaller barrel. There's more surface area of the vessel in relation, in like proportion to the wine. So you get a little bit more communication to the outside, to the atmosphere. You get a little bit more oxidization. So Rioja is another like relatively high elevation, dry, rocky appellation that's on the border between Navarra and the Basque countryside. These two pretty like traditional Catholic parts of Spain up in the northeast. So they grow primarily Tempranillo here. There's a little bit of other stuff like Graciano and things, but it's primarily Tempranillo. This, I believe, is 100% Tempranillo. This is an old winemaking family in Rioja. The Ialbas, Santiago Ialba, had been working as in the wine business as a wine, like in wineries since he was a teenager, and then formed his own winery. I think he had like after 40 years of working in the wine business, he formed his own winery back in the 90s. His son works with him now. This is a Crianza, which means that it's been aged for a minimum of 1 year in oak barrels. Rioja classifies wines based on how long they've been aged in barrel. You have Joven, which I don't know if Joven has any barrel aging requirement. There's just like Rioja, then you have Joven. Crianza is 12 months. Then you have Rioja Reserva, which is 24 months of aging in barrel. And then you have Gran Reserva, which is 3 years in barrel. And so it's like barrel aging is so important to Rioja that all of that is really strictly controlled, and they put a lot of emphasis on it. Organically farmed, hand harvested, fermented with native yeasts from the grape skins. The Abondo, they're trying to make a slightly more like modern Rioja as opposed to like a really traditional, like maybe lighter, maybe more oxidative style. Yeah, and like by more modern, this, just smelling it, this is riper. I smell more fruit, and I can also smell a little bit of oak. I can smell a little bit of like sweet, toasty, like oak to this from the new oak that they use to age it in. Rioja also, part of how Rioja became like what it is, had this reputation. Rioja is relatively close to like Madrid. It's close to the city of Bilbao, and there was a rail line built from Bilbao to Rioja to the town of Haro back in the like late 1800s. So it made it very easy to export wine from Rioja, and that was a huge deal, just being able to get their wine out and get it to France. Tempranillo is, I sort of, in my head, I think of Tempranillo as being kind of similar to Sangiovese. It's like a medium-bodied red grape that has a fair amount of acidity and tannin, and the fruit that it has, it's almost never big and unctuous. It never has the like juicy, lush fruit that you can get with like Cabernet Sauvignon or Malbec or Merlot. Tempranillo, like Sangiovese, is always like sort of slightly lighter, like cherry fruit flavors, sometimes kind of dusty. Every now and then I run into Tempranillos where like it's very young and they've done, something in the initial like maceration. They've managed to get it like really juicy and fruity, but even then it's never like a heavy wine, and it's never as round and lush as Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon can be. So I sort of think of Tempranillo as being kind of like Sangiovese. Where I'm going with this is that Tempranillo, like Sangiovese, it's kind of a chameleon. Like depending on the production per vine or per hectare, and how ripe the grapes are and how much skin contact you give the wine, you can make really light, elegant Tempranillos. You can make pretty structured, like really linear, intense, tannic Tempranillos. You can make really like smoky, gamey, savory Tempranillos. Like Tempranillo is a grape that more than some others, like more than like Malbec or Cabernet Franc, like Tempranillo, I feel like really tastes like where it comes from and the winemaking. And depending on those variables, you can wind up with wines that are completely different and almost unrecognizable as Tempranillo. But Rioja has this particular style that people recognize at this point. People expect Rioja to be like sort of fuller bodied, but also tannic and savory and dry, and like this a little dusty, like spicy sort of character. And so a lot of Rioja, particularly when you get into like Rioja Crianza and Reservas and stuff like this, they're made to follow that style, that expectation that consumers and the market has. And I feel like this is a really good expression, like a good example of that really like classic Rioja style. Like it has pretty juicy ripe fruit. It also, you can smell the oak barrels. It's got, relatively speaking, a lot of tannic structure. Like it's savory. The tannins go from the mid palate like right through the back of the wine and like linger on after the finish. It's kind of spicy. There's a little bit of like black olive in there. It's kind of dusty, savory, and I get like, it makes me think of a hot, dry, windy place. And I get a little bit, yeah, there's also like a little bit of like a savory sort of meaty quality to it. Like to me, this is just, I included this because I feel like this is a very classic Rioja Crianza. And so much of Spain for a long, it's changing now, but sort of like Chris was saying or alluding to earlier, for a long time, Rioja was the Spanish wine region that was successful internationally, that people in the rest of the world recognized and were willing to spend more money on. And so a lot of the rest of Spain, the wine regions sort of measured themselves or defined themselves against Rioja, and a lot of them sort of wanted to be Rioja or like emulated Rioja, hoping that they could sort of like duplicate Rioja's success, or that they could like sell their wines in America or the Netherlands as like a more affordable alternative to Rioja. That's what Ribera del Duero did. That's what Toro has done. That's what parts of like Navarra have done, and that's changing now as like wine consumers are interested in more things and like open to different wines and stuff. A lot of regions are trying to like establish their own identities now, but Rioja, for a long time, Rioja was almost like the center of gravity in Spanish fine winemaking. And I think that's it for everything I have to say about where Spain has come from and where Spain has been and where Spain is going to now. So next week, like I was saying, next Thursday, I'm going to do Spain again. It's going to be Spain 2, and it's going to be more like the future, like how has Spain changed and where is Spain going? What are we going to see in the next 10 years? A lot of new producers and exciting stuff. I'll send all of you more information about that. Does anybody have any questions for me now on any of these?
Do you mind just telling us what the vintages were? I got the last one.
Oh, sure. Let's see. So the Rueda, the Verdejo is 2018. The Dandelion is 2019. The Pallido is a Solera, so it says L19. So it was probably bottled like last year or something like that. The Lasenda Vendemiatrix is 2019. The K-Pi Daniel Ramos is 2018. And then the Abondo here is 2015.
Awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Anything else? Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for coming and doing this and listening to us for an hour and a half and tasting all of these wines. I really appreciate it. I'm going to try and keep this up. Thanks a lot. I will send out information about next week and also a link to that video about the Spanish Civil War, because I just think that like first person historical stuff, like actually being able to see video of things like that from history and hearing from people who are there is pretty awesome. So I'll send that out. Thanks a lot.
Thanks,
Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.